We will start. Good afternoon. And Happy New Year. And I'm very happy to be here because I had torn retina that I tore last week, and I had it repaired surgically by laser on Monday and Tuesday. So thank you, Dr. Beiser, Dr. Rami, and
You have a
I'm
mic?
here.
A mic?
I don't have a mic. Can you hear me? All right.
I'll do the best I can.
Okay. No, I don't have a mic, but they could get me a mic. I'll tell them to. But anyway, so thanks to my doctors, I am here, and I'm going to talk about 1942. This is January 6th, and at this point, America has been at war for 4 weeks in 1 day. And here are some of the people who brought you this war, so to speak. Franklin Roosevelt, the Axis countries, America at war. This started in 1940 when Americans, or rather Roosevelt and the Congress, decided, well, we better start preparing for war and we better start having a draft. And the draft started in 1940. There were internment camps, Japanese internment camps in both the United States and in Canada. The WACs were formed in 1942. That's Camp Shanks up in Orangetown, New York. I took my wife there a number of years ago, about 5 years ago. And she said, "Where are we going?" I said, "We're going to Camp Shanks." "What's that?" I said, "It was the area that your father last saw in the United States before he headed off to Northern Africa." Automakers had to change. You weren't going to get any new cars anymore. Cars were now, or the auto companies now, had turned their factories into a war machine as opposed to selling new cars. And rationing, how many of you remember rationing? Okay, so what did you ration? You rationed, well,
Everything.
everything.
Food, the shoes, the clothing, everything.
Everything. Shoes.
My father had a shoe store. He had a bigger coupon in, get your shoes.
To get shoes, and you only could get one pair of shoes a year. One pair of shoes a year. If you, your mothers couldn't get nylons, couldn't get nylon stockings, right? So some women drew a line down the back of whatever stockings they had to look like nylons. But anybody have any victory gardens? Because I've had people tell me in Brooklyn, empty lots became victory gardens in Brooklyn. So there was a victory garden. War bonds. Let's all fight, buy war bonds. I had a guy tell me last month that he was about 10 years old and he collected all the stamps.
Right.
And you had to turn in the stamps for the war bonds. And he was telling me that it upset him. I said, why was that? He said, I was a stamp collector. And I had to give up my stamps to get a war bond. So anyway, war bonds. There is a war in Eastern Europe. There is a war in the Pacific. And the Manhattan Project starts. Hopefully, in Roosevelt's mind and others, the Americans can put together an atomic bomb. Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941.
December 7th.
Yeah, I gave this talk up in Connecticut a couple of weeks ago. Actually, it was the 41 talk. And a woman was telling me her brother was at Pearl Harbor, and that he was in the shop repairing things, and he said literally the planes flew right over him, and you could see the pilots' faces as they flew over them. So it's January 1st, 1942, or on January 1st, 1942, America was in its 24th day of fighting World War II. January 6th would be 29 days. America entered the war more than 2 years after it started with Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939. Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. Much of the U.S. naval fleet was damaged or destroyed, and ultimately 2,400 Americans were killed, roughly 2,400 Americans. Another shot, December 7th, 1941. The attack commenced at 7:48 in the morning. That would be 12:48 in the afternoon, New York time, Hawaiian time. The base was attacked by 353 Imperial Japanese fighter planes, bombers, and torpedoes. Planes in 2 waves launched from 6 aircraft carriers. All 8 U.S. Navy battleships were destroyed, 4 of them sunk. All but the USS Arizona were later raised. 6 returned to service and went to fight on the war. Now, I went up to Hyde Park a number of years ago because I needed to talk to Franklin. Franklin and Eleanor, very nice hosts. I mean, yeah, they're a little stiff, you know, but they had some books that you could read, except they were a little hard to read. But anyway, I do a number of talks based around Roosevelt, including the 1936 Berlin Olympics, where Marty Glickman and Sam Stoller never ran because of anti-Semitism. But more to the point, why did America send its athletes to an Olympic celebration in Berlin in 1936? And Roosevelt felt the athletes shouldn't be involved. This was a diplomatic crisis. And Marty Glickman, who I worked with in 1988 at his broadcast school, I also knew Sam Stoller, he ran the Milrose game, told me he agreed with Roosevelt. Fastest kid in Brooklyn. He wanted to go to Berlin, win the gold medal in the 4x100 relay, get up on that podium and shove that gold medal right in the Fuhrer's face. Well, that didn't happen. I also do a talk on 1939. Roosevelt was the first civilian, so to speak, on television at the New York World's Fair, April 30th, 1939, so I want to know a little bit about that. And also something that'll come up a little later in the 1942 talk. So it's December 7th, 1941, and early in the afternoon, Roosevelt and his chief foreign policy aide, a guy named Harry Hopkins, were interrupted by a telephone call from the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, and they were told that Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. And there is another look at Pearl Harbor. About 5 o'clock in the afternoon, following meetings with his military advisors, FDR calmly and decisively dictated to his secretary, Grace Tully, a request to Congress for a declaration of war. Doesn't come on December 7th, comes on December 8th. Roosevelt cannot, nor can any president, declare war on another country. Congress has to approve. So it's December 8th, 1941, calls for the declaration of war against Japan, and calls December 7th, a date that shall live in infamy, and told the U.S. Congress that the nation was in grave danger. A date that will live in infamy. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Congress votes to go to war. One member of Congress says no. That was the representative, Jeannette Rankin, House of Representative, Congresswoman. First Congresswoman ever to serve, elected in 1916. State of Montana, before the women had the right to vote. She was a pacifist. She voted against the U.S. entering World War I. The isolation policy that America had been in for many, many years, going back to the 1924 Immigration Act, ended. America goes to war. And that is Rankin in 1932. No more war. Rankin believed that Roosevelt deliberately provoked the Japanese to attack because he wanted to bring the U.S. into the European war against Germany. It's a picture of Pearl Harbor. Last time I was out there about 5 years ago. The Hawaiian territorial governor, a guy by the name of Joseph B. Poindexter, declared martial law. All authority was turned over to the military, which proceeded to remove persons from military-sensitive areas, set curfews, regulated night driving, censored newspapers, and radio broadcasts, and controlled prices on everything from groceries to prostitutes. Now wait a minute. This one gets me. I don't know if it gets you, but it
I had to
gets
add something.
me. Yeah, all right. How do you know what a prostitute charges? Doesn't it depend on the day and how much business? And the other thing is, prostitutes file income tax returns. Like, do they file a 1099? Yeah, I made this amount of money being a prostitute. Prostitutes, that's unusual. But civil courts were closed and the writ of habeas corpus was suspended. Well, this guy came from the Bronx. A guy by the name of Hank Greenberg. Anybody ever hear of him?
Yeah, baseball.
Baseball. He was 10 years older than my mother-in-law. He was born in 1911. My mother-in-law was born in 1921. They both went to James Monroe High School in the Bronx. So anyway, Hank, excuse me? Your husband went to James Monroe as well. So anyway, and the New York Yankees didn't bother signing him, nor did the New York Giants. He signed with the Detroit Tigers. So he's a baseball star. He was discharged from the Army on December 5th, 1941, as were all men over the age of 28. But 2 days later, Pearl Harbor was attacked, and Greenberg voluntarily re-enlisted and requested to be assigned to the Army Air Corps. He was not the only one ready to fight for his country. I knew his son, or know his son, Stephen Greenberg. He was the deputy baseball commissioner back in the 1990s, and we were talking about a whole bunch of things about his father's career. And he told me that in the late 30s into the 40s, every time Hank Greenberg went up to home plate, he looked at a ball coming in at him, and he saw the face of Hitler, and he wanted to bash the ball as hard as he could. Now, Greenberg was a secular Jew. He was not a religious Jew. He was a secular Jew, but ethnically he was Jewish, and he felt an affinity, obviously, to the Jewish people. He also decides to go to war. December 11th, 1941, Hitler announces that Germany is going to war, and Germany and Italy honor their pact with Japan. They declare war against the U.S., and America is quickly forced to get a military machine up and running. But it's not just a military machine. It's a civilian population that has to provide support for the military. So whether you were drafted or not, you were involved in this war, and you said you were 5 years old. There were babies who got war rationing points. Babies got war rationing points. So it was from cradle to crib, people who were involved in this war. So you have to build a war machine, and they have to do it quickly. They have to raise and train and outfit a vast military force in the United States, and also to provide material to hard-pressed allies in Great Britain, who's being bombed, and the Soviet Union. Soviet Union is in the siege of Leningrad at this point. Meeting these challenges would require massive government spending, conversion of existing industry to wartime production, construction of huge new factories, changes in consumption, and restrictions on many aspects of American life. Government, industry, and labor would have to cooperate. Contributions from all Americans, young, old, men, women, white, black, Hispanic, Native Americans, would be necessary to build up what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. Remember December 7th. I guess they were trying to cash in on Remember the Maine, because that slogan never really took off. Remember December 7th. Pearl Harbor did. Keep America free. And by the way, if you take a look at this Japanese guy here, the buck teeth, the thick glasses, that would be considered today politically incorrect because you're making fun of his looks. And that would be a critical thing during World War II in cartoons, because some cartoons got banned eventually because of that look. The primary task facing America in 1941, raising and training a credible military force. Concern over the threat of war had spurred Roosevelt and Congress to approve the nation's first peacetime draft in September 1940. By December 1941, America's military had 2.2 million soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. They also had women, the WACs. The Women Army Corps, created as an auxiliary unit. The women The Women's Army Auxiliary Corps on May 15th converted to active status in the Army of the United States. The first 800 members of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps began basic training at Fort Des Moines, Provisional Army Officers Training School in Iowa. I got a question for you here. There were 3 criteria of women, how they judged them intellectually or intelligence. Now, let me ask you a question. Would you have telephone operator or switchboard operator, then mechanic, then cook? Or would you have mechanic, switchboard operator, then cook? Who is more important, switchboard operators or the mechanics to fix the equipment?
Mechanics.
Mechanics. But in the Army's wisdom, they said no. They wanted the smartest to work the switchboard. They needed to be quick and nimble. So the brightest and nimblest were trained as switchboard operators. Next came the mechanics, who had to have a high degree of mechanical aptitude and problem-solving ability, which you would think would be more important than a telephone operator. And the bakers were usually the lowest scoring recruits, so they went into the mess hall. She's helping to win. How about you? Serve in the Navy. Women. The WAVES, or Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, established by the United States Congress, signed into law by President Franklin Roosevelt during July. The establishment of the WAVES made it easier for the Navy to fill clerical and office roles at home, in shore stations, while allowing men to return to active
We had to
duty.
move because the waves took our apartment
Where were
on
you
Kingsbridge
living?
Road in the Bronx.
On what road? Which road?
The waves.
Yeah, but what road in the Bronx did you have to move?
In Kingsbridge, Kingsbridge.
Oh, Kingbridge.
Took our apartment.
Were you close to the armory?
We had to move.
You had to move, so they kicked you out. They kicked you out immediately. Chrysler plant. I don't see any cars there, do you?
No.
No cars. The American economy had to be converted to wartime production. Millions of men and women entered the service, which meant changes in American life. And that opened up an opportunity for women, African Americans, and other minorities. Because the guys are gone, somebody's got to do the work, and women were basically begged to go take the jobs. And I don't know how many of your mothers or grandmothers had jobs, but they had opportunities to work for the first time since the flapper days of the 1920s. America's at war, gasoline, ration, an A-card. An A-card. Remember the A-cards? A-card. 3 gallons of gas a week. That's all you were able to get. America at war. Don't you know there's a war on? That was a common expression. Rationing became part of everybody's life. Americans learned to conserve vital resources. They lived with price controls, dealt with shortages of everything, from nylons to housing, and volunteered for jobs ranging from air raid warden to Red Cross worker. I have had 3 people in the last month tell me that their mothers were air raid wardens during World War II. America's at war. There's your ration books. There are your coupons, and brought it into the shoe store, right, to get their 1 pair of shoes. In May, the U.S. Office of Price Administration froze prices on practically all everyday goods, starting with sugar and coffee. War ration books and tokens were issued to each American family, dictating how much gasoline, tires, sugar, meat, shoes, nylon, and other items any one person could buy. A wartime edition of the American Women's Cookbook contained revised recipes and gave advice on dealing with food shortages. Any of you have a victory garden? Anybody see a victory garden in their
We
neighborhood?
had a garden, but it was always there.
Oh, it was always there. Well, it became a victory garden anyway. And if you notice, that's Donald Duck. This is a victory garden. Pests keep out. The pest kind of looks like Hitler in that picture. Scram. To conserve and produce more food, a Food for Victory campaign was launched. Eating leftovers became a patriotic duty, not something you did after Thanksgiving. Civilians were urged to grow their own vegetables and fruits. Millions of victory gardens planted and maintained by ordinary citizens appeared in backyards, vacant lots, and public parks, and from what I understand in Brooklyn, in front of the Armory in Brooklyn. Make do or do without. Do with less so they'll have enough, including coffee. Rationing gives you your fair share. Make do or do without. War production created shortages of critical supplies. To overcome these shortages, war planners searched for substitutes. One key metal in limited supply was copper. It was used in many war-related products, including assault wire. The military needed millions of miles of this wire to communicate on the battlefields. So the military needed more than guns and ammunition to do its job. They counted on you and me if we're back home. The Army had to be fed. The Army's standard K ration included chocolate bars, which were produced in high numbers. Cocoa production was increased to make it possible. Sugar was another ingredient in chocolate. Sugar was rationed to civilians. How would you like to ride on a wooden tire? I was on a stagecoach once in Old Tucson, the movie studios where they did a lot of westerns. This is going back about 30 years. And I was on the stagecoach, and I think they had wooden tires, and you felt everything. It was great for the kidneys. Great for the kidneys. Anyway, this guy is proudly showing off. He's driving on a wooden tire to save tires. The American military needed millions of tires for jeeps and trucks and other vehicles. Tires required rubber. Rubber was also used to produce tanks and planes. The Japanese Imperial Army controlled the Dutch East Indies, or today Indonesia, beginning in March, creating a shortage of rubber that affected American production. Share your car, spare your tires. Speed limits, gas rationing forced people to limit their driving. 17 eastern states, gas was rationed to 3 gallons, which meant about 45 miles a week you could drive. This reduced the wear and tear on tires. A synthetic rubber industry was created. The public also carpooled and contributed rubber scrap for recycling. And some of you might remember your war rationing book number 1. If you played around and they caught you, you might end up with 10 years of in prison, or being in prison for 10 years, or a $10,000 fine, or both. And the book belonged to you. You couldn't give it to somebody else. And if you died, the book died with you. You could not transfer it to somebody else. Any person finding a lost book must deliver it promptly to the nearest rationing board. So, that was it. You had to ration. The war disrupted trade, limiting availability of some goods, and your father was probably like him. This guy is running a little grocery when there weren't the big supermarkets, and she's buying pears and some other things, and he's looking through the book to see how many points she just gave him, or whether she could buy it or not. Americans received their first rationing cards in May. The first card, war rationing card number 1, became known as the sugar book, for one of the commodities Americans could purchase with their rationing card was sugar. Again, I needed to talk to Franklin Roosevelt about a whole bunch of things. January 1st, all sales of cars, as well as delivery of cars to customers who had previously contracted for them, were frozen by the American government's Office of Production Management. On February 14th, the American government puts all new cars that are in stock in long-term storage. The work on new cars was finished on February 22nd. On January 10th, the freeze order was amended to permit the sales of cars to 3 categories: Army, Navy, U.S. Marines, Commission, Panama Canal Zone, and other certain government agencies. Persons assigned to an A1J or higher preference rating. Prime contractors with the Army and Navy for construction of defense projects with an A1J or higher rating. Making tanks, not cars. Automobile makers began not only building tanks, but trucks, airplanes, jeeps, torpedoes, and even helmets. Factories were stripped down to make way for new equipment, and many car parts were remelted as steel mills, at steel mills for use in war efforts. I don't know how many of you remember this, scrap days? You remember scrap days? Remember bringing stuff over, which basically was junk?
But I bought something that I shouldn't have.
What'd you buy? You can tell me now, it's 80 years
A very
later.
good bronze piece.
A bronze piece. You know, I can't turn you in. 7 years is statute of limitations.
Yeah, but.
You're talking 80 years
But
ago.
I shouldn't have.
So you feel guilty about it?
They got over it. My father collected antiques.
Oh, okay, so you got it. Anyway, wanted for victory, waste paper, old rags, scrap metals, old rubber. Get in the scrap. Sell it to a collector or give it to a charity. And you bought some bronze, but they got over it. In October, the United States government increasingly encourages U.S. citizens to donate and gather scrap metals and fabrics for a war effort. Scrap days. I don't know if you remember scrap days. Scrap days are held throughout the country and ask ordinary people to take any scrap materials they could get their hands on and bring it to your local scrap merchant. The scrap would be used to create the raw materials needed to build tanks and guns and ships that were desperately needed. Any baseball fans here? Baseball fans? One baseball fan. Baseball fan. Were you a
Yeah,
baseball
yeah.
fan?
I
Okay.
remember his
Yeah.
name.
Yeah, that's the baseball commissioner, Kennesaw Mountain Landis. And he has a problem. He's in the dither. Now, back in 1918, during World War I, the season was shortened because of the war. Not because of the Spanish flu, which came a couple months later, but because of the war. And he doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know what to do, and he decides to write Roosevelt a letter. What should we do for 1942? President Roosevelt, please give us some guidance. Give us some guidance. And that's the letter that he sent to the White House asking for some guidance or a suggestion, whatever. Landis writes to the president about baseball. If you believe we ought to close down for the duration of the war, we are ready to do so. If you feel we ought to continue, we would be delighted to do so. We await your order. But an order never comes. There is no order. It's just a suggestion. Basically, Roosevelt knows that baseball is important to the psyche of the country because back in those days, baseball was the king of all sports. The great DiMaggio, right? Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth hadn't been too far from retirement at that point, only 6 years. Lou Gehrig, you know, the great Lou Gehrig giving his emotional speech, which actually was forgotten until Pride of the Yankees came out in 1942. Anyway, FDR response. I honestly feel that it would be best for the country to keep baseball going. Baseball provides a recreation which does not last over 2 hours or 2.5 hours, which can be gotten for very little cost, both of which are not true today. Games last more than 3 hours, and for $1,800 you could have gotten a seat at the Yankee playoff game this year. Of course, Roosevelt didn't matter to him. His class could afford it. And incidentally, I hope that night games can be extended because it gives an opportunity to the day shift to see a game occasionally. Blackouts. How many of you live with blackouts? So the lights just went off, right? It wasn't every day. They were mostly drills.
The shade down.
Shades down, right. Now, this had to be in the winter. And the blackout, 5 a.m. till dawn. There were places in the United States, my daughter lives in Seattle, where the sun doesn't come up this time of the year till about 8:30 in the morning. And north you go to Alaska, of course, and you have limited daylight. So the blackouts. Officials in some American coastal cities were well aware of their vulnerability to air attacks and began ordering practice blackouts long before December 7th, 1941, which was the bombing of Pearl Harbor. On March 8th, 1941, Seattle became the first major American city to test its blackout procedures. I don't know how well you could see this, so I'll point it out to you. This was the normal skyline in St. Louis, Missouri, December 1942. Blackout. Blackout. In St. Louis, more than likely in 1942, St. Louis was not going to be hit with bombs. The German bombers barely got to England, and the Japanese bombers, well, they were sent down on the ship and to Pearl Harbor. They were sent down on the ship, and they made the trip off of aircraft carriers. So more than likely, St. Louis, right in the middle of the United States, the United States protected by two oceans, is not going to get hit with a German plane or a Japanese plane. It was December 14th that St. Louis had its first blackout test. But like I said, it was more than likely that St. Louis was never going to be hit. But they had to prepare for the worst. No night baseball in Brooklyn. Any old Brooklyn Dodger fans here who went to Brooklyn Dodger
No,
games?
Giants, Giants,
Giants, you're one of the few
the
people.
polo grounds.
You're one of the few people, when I talk about baseball or this, say Giants. You're outnumbered by Brooklyn Dodger fans about 15-1. If I'm doing a talk or talks and I'll ask about the Dodgers, there'll be about 15 or 16 say, yeah, Dodgers, before you got one Giants. And you went to Dodger Ebbets Field? Ebbets Field, do you know the
My
right,
cousin coached the Giants,
what was his name?
Allie Sherman.
Oh, I know Allie.
He's gone.
I know he's gone. I knew him from when he was at on the
Brooklyn
TV side.
College. First he played for
Yeah, he
Brooklyn,
played for
then he
Brooklyn.
coached.
Okay, went to Philadelphia.
I sat
Yeah.
freezing to death
Yeah,
when I had to go to those games.
yeah, and Allie, of course, coached the Giants, got fired, and had a very successful TV career afterwards. Extremely successful TV career. He was better off in the TV career than he was playing football. So Allie was a nice guy. He was a really nice guy. I dealt with him a few times, so he was good. Anyway, that's Brooklyn. And they decided Brooklyn was one of the first places to have lights in night baseball. But they decided that would be a target. So no night baseball. Here in New York, office buildings and apartment houses throughout the city were required to veil windows if the building was more than 15 stories high. Stores, restaurants, bars toned down their exterior lighting. Street lights and traffic signals had their wattage reduced. A woman said to me, we had a car where we had to put a hood over the lights. Light was hooded. Night baseball banned in the Statue of Liberty. The torch did not
Shut the light
glow.
out.
What?
Shut the,
They shut it off. War bonds for victory. Buy United States Defense Bond stamps. Bonds were available in denominations from 25 bucks to 1,000, designed to be affordable for everybody. For 10 cents, people could purchase stamps. That's where that guy who was 10 years old in 5th grade started complaining about it, because he put it in special albums and he wanted to keep the album, but he couldn't. When the albums were filled, they were redeemed for a bond. War stamps were especially popular with children. Anybody collect war stamps? You did. You did. You did. There was TV in New York. There was TV. Channel 1, WNBT, which debuted April 30th, 1939 at the World's Fair. Roosevelt was the first person on TV, commercial TV. But 1942, you talked about there was no TV in 1942, and to a certain extent, you're absolutely correct. April 1st, the U.S. War Production Board halts the manufacturing of television and radio equipment for consumer use. On April 13th, the Federal Communications Commission minimum programming time required for U.S. television stations is reduced from 15 hours to 4 hours a week. So basically, there was hardly any TV on. But there was the United States Office of War Information, which basically was propaganda. It was created on June 13th by Roosevelt, Executive Order 9182. Though radio broadcasts, newspapers, posters, photographs, films, and other forms of media were out there, the OWI was a connection between the battlefront and civilian communities. The office also established several overseas branches, which launched a large-scale information and propaganda campaign abroad, the Voice of America, which is still in business. The Voice of America radio programming began in early February. The program was established as a World War II propaganda tool that would broadcast news of war in effort to fight against Nazi propaganda and help boost the morale of Allied troops abroad. There were internment camps in the United States. Something that struck me as rather funny was when I was in Los Angeles in 2015. A friend of mine, the late Shelley Saltman, was on the board of directors of the Skirball Museum, and there is some Skirball archives here in New York somewhere. I forgot where it is, but there's a museum. It's basically dedicated to life during World War II and the Holocaust as well. But they also have the internment camps, which caught me as kind of odd because this wasn't exactly something I expected in a museum that talked about World War II, but mostly from the Jewish perspective. Anyway, February 19th, Roosevelt signs Executive Order 9066 with the stated intention of preventing espionage on American shores. Military zones were created in California and Washington, states with large Japanese-American populations. The Roosevelt Executive Order forcibly removed Americans of Japanese ancestry from their homes, even though they were American citizens. And they're off to an internment camp. In all, about 120,000 people of Japanese descent in the mainland U.S., not including Hawaii, including 70,000 U.S. citizens. And Hawaii was a territory at that point. In Canada, there were internment camps as well. After Canada's declaration of war on Japan, December 8, 1941, many called for the uprooting and internment of Japanese Canadians under the Defense of Canada regulations. Remember, Canada joined the war on September 3, 1939, because they're part of the English Commonwealth. Since the arrival of Japanese, Chinese, and South Asian immigrants to British Columbia in the late 1800s, there had been calls for their exclusion. Finally, they were able to get rid of them. They had an excuse. About a week after Roosevelt sends Americans to internment camps, Japanese Canadians were being moved for reasons of national security, stripped of their homes and businesses, like in America, sent to internment camps and farms in British Columbia and other parts of Canada. The policy included the theft, seizure, and sale of property belonging to Japanese Canadians, included fishing boats and motor vehicles, houses, farms, businesses, and personal belongings. Japanese Canadians were forced to use the proceeds of forced sales to pay for their basic needs during internment. Now, I've gone about 40 minutes so far. I haven't talked about the war, have I?
No.
Because you had to get the people back home acclimated to the war. And, well, it's time to talk about the war. And there is the war. On January 20th, Nazis at the Wannsee Conference in Berlin decide the final solution to the Jewish problem is relocation and extermination. January 20th, 1942. Later this month, there will be the recognition of International Holocaust Day, which the UN has sanctioned. But the Germans needed laborers. Dachau. The incarceration of increasing numbers of people in concentration camps assured the quantity of the labor supply, even though the brutality of life inside the camps depleted the number of available laborers. The SS used gas chambers and other means to weed out prisoners, Jews, Romas or Gypsies, homosexuals, political enemies of Hitler, who were no longer able to work. And the Americans get a really poor start to the war, a very, very poor start to the war. After all, They're only in it at this point for a little more than 2 months. The Allies' attempt to intercept the Japanese invasion fleet was defeated in the 7-hour Battle of the Java Sea on February 27th. 5 Allied warships were lost, 1 Japanese destroyer damaged. The Japanese landed at 3 points on Java on February 28th and rapidly expanded their beachheads. On March 9th, 20,000 Allied troops in Java surrendered. Japan took over Guam, American territory, Hong Kong, British territory, Wake Island, Singapore, British territory, Philippines, American territory. Japan's initial war plans were realized with the capture of Java. But despite the military triumphs, the Japanese saw no indication that the Allies, led by the Americans, were ready for a negotiated peace. General Douglas MacArthur leaves the Philippines. I shall return. After struggling against great odds to save the Philippines from the Japanese conquest, MacArthur abandons the island fortress of Corregidor under orders from Roosevelt. Left behind on the Bataan Peninsula are 90,000 American and Philippine troops. Of course, the Philippines, part of America, American territory, so they were American citizens, who lacked food, supplies, support, and who would soon succumb to the Japanese offensive.
But he said, I shall return.
I shall return, and he did. The Bataan Death March. Forcible transfer by the Imperial Japanese Army of between 60 and 80,000 American and Filipino prisoners of war from Bataan to Camp O'Donnell. The prisoners were forced to march despite many dying on the journey. Transfer started on April 9th after a 3-month battle of Bataan in the Philippines. The distance that they went was somewhere between 60 and 70 miles. This really didn't do anything. The Doolittle raid didn't do a thing. Really didn't cause any damage or anything, except it got under the Japanese skin. On April 18th, 16 U.S. bombers raided Tokyo. They did little real
Would
damage.
you do me a favor, please, and close the door?
Excuse me, can you close the door? Can you close that door? Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Okay. They did little real damage, but the raid stunned the Japanese population because Japanese leaders, Hirohito Tojo, had promised the mainland would never be attacked. Far more important were the consequences of the U.S. intelligence services' detection of Japanese planes to seize Port Moresby and Tulagi in the southern Solomon Islands, the Battle of the Coral Sea. That's in early May, and it's the U.S. and its Japanese forces clashing. Both sides suffered major losses, but the U.S. Navy, for the first time, checked a major Japanese offensive. Then comes the Battle of Midway, and things begin to turn for the Americans. It's going to take a while, though. Decisive victory in the air and sea battle between June 3rd and June 6th, successful defense of a major base located at Midway Island dashed Japan's hopes of neutralizing the United States as a naval power. The Battle of Midway effectively turned the tide of World War II in the Pacific. Meanwhile, things are beginning to look slightly better for Russia or Soviet Union. Soviet Union did the heavy lifting in Europe. They're the ones that really, those are the people who really beat Hitler. The United States and the Allies contributed, but it was the Soviets that did all the bleeding, so to speak. Germany's march through Europe started on September 1st, 1939. But Soviet forces launched a counteroffensive against the Germans in Stalingrad in mid-November. They quickly encircled the entire German army, 220,000 soldiers. The Battle of Stalingrad would eventually prove to be a decisive psychological turning point, ending a string of German victories in the summer of 1942, and the Germans begin to retreat. And then there's this, the Battle of Milne Bay. And that sees the United States and Australia fight the Japanese in New Guinea. It takes place over a 13-day period, August 25th through September 7th. The Japanese forces attempted to attack Allied airfields at Milne Bay, but they underestimated the number of Allied troops there. The Japanese forces have to abandon the attack, marking the first battle in which the Allies defeated the Japanese in a land battle.
Wow.
Then came Guadalcanal. On September 13th, the Japanese launched a major offensive against the Americans at Guadalcanal and sustained heavy casualties. On December 31st, the Japanese planned to withdraw their troops from Guadalcanal after suffering heavy losses in the number of battles that would end in February 1943. Northern Africa. My father-in-law served in Northern Africa. He was there in Northern Africa. Told me about General Patton. So he saw Patton address the troops and he said, "Patton spoke like this! He spoke like Mickey Mouse! Had this high voice!" Anyway, but that's later on. On October 23rd, British forces attacked the German army at El Alamein, North Africa, Egypt. On November 4th, the German army in North Africa is in full retreat after suffering a comprehensive defeat at the hands of the British 8th Army under General Bernard Montgomery. Meanwhile, not very far from here, over at Columbia University, something is going on. The Manhattan Project. On January 19th, United States President Franklin Roosevelt formally authorizes the atomic bomb project. In June, the U.S. Army established the Manhattan Project to handle its part in the atomic bomb project and begin the process of transferring responsibility from the Office of Scientific Research and Development to the military. That was Robert Oppenheimer who led the Manhattan Project in that picture. In September, Lieutenant General Leslie Richard Groves Jr. was appointed director of what would become the Manhattan Project, and he selected J. Robert Oppenheimer to head the project's secret weapons laboratory. There is still life in the United States. There is still life. Boston, the Coconut Grove burns to the ground. And that would change a lot of laws in terms of exits and entrances into buildings. November 28th, the Coconut Grove, one of Boston's swankiest nightclubs, became an inferno, trapping hundreds of victims as they jammed the club's exits. Less than 15 minutes, 492 people were dead, 166 injured, making the blaze the deadliest nightclub fire in U.S. history. There's an ironic twist to the story, which I'll get to in a couple of minutes.
What year was that?
1942. Okay, how many of you have seen this movie, Casablanca? Okay,
My favorite.
your favorite. You saw the movie? How many,
Yeah.
your favorite movie? How many
One
other?
of my favorites.
Not mine.
Not your favorite, but
One of my favorites.
one of your favorites. Humphrey Bogart, Ingrid Bergman, Paul Heinrich, produced by Warner Brothers.
Great picture.
Okay, I have a question for you. Did anybody in the movie ever say, "Play it again, Sam"? Yes or no?
Say that again?
Did anybody in the movie ever say, "Play it again, Sam"? Yes or no?
They said they did.
Well, let's see. Let's see if they ever did.
I didn't hear
Okay.
what they said.
Rick Blaine, Humphrey Bogart, owns a nightclub in Casablanca and discovers his old flame, Ilsa,
Right.
Ingrid Bergman, is in town with her husband, Victor Laszlo, Paul Henry. Laszlo is a famed rebel, and the Germans are on his tail. Ilsa knows Rick could get them out of the country, Morocco. Okay, so we come to the scene. Play it again, Sam, right? Play it again. Rick Blaine, Humphrey Bogart's character, never says play it again, Sam. The line is not in the movie. Ilsa, play it once, Sam, for old time's sake. Sam, the piano player. I don't know what you mean, Miss Ilsa. Ilsa, play it, Sam. Play as time goes by. You must remember this.
I saw that picture 10 times.
10 times.
Every time it's on.
I have a story about Humphrey Bogart when we get to the end.
When are you showing it
Yeah.
here?
Bambi. How many of you saw the movie Bambi? This is not necessarily a children's movie, even though it's supposed to be a children's movie. Bambi was an American animated drama film produced by Walt Disney. It's based on the 1923 book Bambi, A Life in the Woods by Austrian author and hunter Felix Salten. The film was released by RKO Pictures on August 13th. The film did not perform as well at the box office as it was hoped because of the war. Disney could not get the film into the European market. Anybody dreaming of a white Christmas?
Bing Crosby.
But who wrote it?
Yeah.
Who wrote the
Irving
song?
Berlin.
Irving Berlin,
Yeah.
who's dreaming of a white Christmas of his childhood that never existed because they fled Russia. He was Jewish, and they fled Russia because of the pogroms. White Christmas is an Irving Berlin song reminiscing about an old-fashioned Christmas setting, which Berlin never experienced. The song was written by Berlin for the musical film Holiday Inn. The composition won the Academy Award for Best Original Song at the 15th Academy Awards. The first public performance of White Christmas was by Bing Crosby on the NBC radio show The Kraft Music Hall, Christmas Day, December 25th, 1941. Initially, the song performed poorly. It was overshadowed by Holiday Inn's first hit song, Be Careful, It's My Heart. By the end of October 1942, White Christmas topped your hit parade chart. How many of you listened to your hit parade?
But who sang Be Careful, It's My Heart? I can't think of her
I can't
name.
think of it either.
It'll come to me tonight.
It might be Richard Hames, maybe.
No, it was a woman.
It was a woman. I don't know. I'll look it up.
Dinah Shore.
Maybe Dinah Shore. Might be Dinah Shore. Choose one then.
No.
Who else was around there? It was the Andrews Sisters. Probably wasn't them. So anyway, Stage Door Canteen. Did you go there?
I remember one on Times Square.
That's the one. That's the one. Stage Door Canteen was started and directed by the American Theater Wing. War Service Inc., the first stage door canteen, opened in New York on March
We used to
2nd.
go to the dances down there at the stage door
Yeah.
canteen.
Oh,
I'm going to go back a long time.
yeah, well, that's what they did because this was on 44th Street, right? The canteen offers servicemen nights of dancing, so did you dance with the servicemen?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm old enough to know all this here.
Yeah. So did you dance with them? Get any dates with them? Any of the servicemen? Did you get any dates with any of the servicemen after dancing? Did you go out with them?
A couple of them.
I went to.
Okay.
That's another story. I'll
That's
tell you.
another story
I'll tell you
altogether.
tomorrow.
Well, you can tell me. We're between friends here. Entertainment, food, and non-alcoholic drinks. And there was an opportunity to rub shoulders with celebrities because the celebrities were there and this was all free. Other stage door canteens would come to Boston and Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia, Cleveland, San Francisco, and Newark. They had their own TV station in Newark once. Toward the end of the war, there were canteens in London and Paris. Bob Hope's first overseas show took place in 1942, but it was in Alaska, which isn't exactly overseas. 9 months after the United States entered World War II, Bob Hope made his first overseas trip to entertain members of the armed forces. Travel was to Alaska. U.S. territory required a special permit. During the war, the Nazis tracked Hope, knowing that if they bombed the area he was in, they could take out several Allied troops as well. By the way, this is where he went, Whittier, Alaska. That's 2006. That's a clear day in Whittier. That's an absolute clear day. This is what Whittier normally looks like. The cruise ship industry is up there right now, and this is 7 o'clock in the evening. Whittier was chosen as a military outpost in Alaska for the United States for the Navy because you couldn't find it. You could not find it. With all your gadgets, you're not going to find it. And there are 200 people who live there, and they all work for the cruise industry now. Hope was offered a commission in the Navy as a lieutenant commander. However, Roosevelt intervened, indicating that was best if Hope continued to entertain troops from all armed services. I don't know if any of you are hockey fans. who followed the New York Rangers, but there was a second team in New York called the New York Americans. Actually, it's the first team. But they were owned by a bootlegger, Big Bill O'Dwyer, who ended up in jail. They really didn't have an owner. They had debt, and they decided to suspend operations after the 1941-42 season. They didn't have any players because most of the National Hockey League players, they came from Canada. And so they didn't have players, they didn't have money, so they asked for a suspension, and that left with the National Hockey League with just 6 teams. The legacy from 1942, The Greatest Generation, a book by Tom Brokaw, came out in 2001. The term was meant as a tribute to the resiliency and the patriotic spirit of those who lived through the Great Depression and then fought in World War II. It would become clear, or not until January 27, 1944, that the U.S. government released information on the Bataan Death March. In September 1945, the Japanese commander of the march, Masahiro Hama, was arrested by Allied troops, indicted for war crimes. February 26, 1946, sentenced to death by firing squad. April 3rd, 1946, he is killed by that firing squad. Hitler committed suicide, April 1945.
That's true.
Japan surrendered, May 1945. Germany surrendered, May 1945. Japan would surrender on September 2nd, 1945, not long after 2 Manhattan Project atomic bombs hit Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. FDR did not see the end of the war. He died on April 12, 1945, a little less than a month before VE Day in Europe. Soldiers came home, didn't talk much about the war. How many of you had a father, husband who served in World War II? Did they ever talk about the war?
Only to my kids years later.
Yeah,
And
years
his
later.
children, our
Yeah.
children.
Yeah, your children and your husband.
He
Did they
never
ever talk
spoke
about
much
the war?
about it.
Only to the boys occasionally.
Occasionally.
No.
They never talked about
Oh, not a lot,
it.
no.
No, never talked about
My
it.
former husband.
Your former husband, he talked about it?
He was a boy at the end of the war.
Yeah. They went to war. My father-in-law never really talked about it. Went to war, did their job, came home, got on with their lives. Americans' isolation policy ended. The internment. The Japanese-American evacuation claims of July 2nd, 1948 provided compensation to Japanese-American citizens removed from the West Coast during World War II for losses of real and personal property. 26,550 claims filed for $142,000. 1988, President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act to compensate more than 100,000 people of Japanese descent who were incarcerated in internment camps during World War II. There was a formal apology, and $20,000 in compensation was given to each surviving victim. The law won congressional approval only after a decade-long campaign by the Japanese-American community. Brian Mulroney, Prime Minister of Canada, who I interviewed way back when. On September 22nd, 1988, Mulroney, the former Prime Minister of Canada, apologized in the House of Commons to all Japanese Canadians. In addition to the apology, the government offered $21,000 each directly to those directly affected by the internment, the creation of a community fund, pardons for those who have been wrongfully imprisoned during the war, and Canadian citizenship for Japanese Canadians and their descendants who have been wrongfully deported to Japan after the war. Women served and got screwed after the war. At the end of the war, the Navy established 5 separation centers for the demobilization of the waves and for Navy nurses. The separation process began on October 1st, 1945. About 9,000 were separated. By the end of 1946, 21,000 had been discharged. The waves lasted until 1978. The women who got out, there was no GI Bill for them. There was no protection for them, like the men. After World War II, the WACs had no legal reemployment rights, no peacetime component, or even inactive reserve. Without these rights, jobs for women would be scarce in peacetime. Congress provided reemployment rights for WACs and WACs on August 9th, 1946. Told you about the Bogart, right? I had a little story about Bogart. My wife is at the right. That is Rita Thompson. She was Humphrey Bogart's mistress for 20 years. And you can see she's got these little things about Bogey. She had a bar in New Orleans called Bogey. She sold it to somebody you might have heard of, Jennifer Flowers. She took us to meet Jennifer Flowers one night. She was Bogey's mistress. She had been, and I don't know if you could see above Bogey's head on the left side, she was runner-up Miss Arizona around, I think, 1938, somewhere around there. And she went to Hollywood, and she wanted to become a star, except she became a stunt woman. And was thrown off horses and all this other stuff, decided she didn't want to be a stunt woman. But she knew a guy who made wigs in Mexico, because she was born in Nogales, Arizona, and there was no border there. And she decided that she'd become a hairdresser and create wigs. And she created a wig for Humphrey Bogart. And they became lovers over 20 years, but you don't hear that story, right? Casablanca launched Ingrid Bergman's career, established Bogart as a romantic lead. It's one of the most referenced films of all time, from Woody Allen's Play It Again, Sam, which is never said in the movie, to The Muppets. Walt Disney once said of Bambi, "It's the best picture I've ever made, the best to ever come out of Hollywood." The reviews weren't as kind. Bambi prompted acknowledgement of animal rights and showed the fearless world animals live in until the inevitable human intrusion. Time magazine's review. Disney's indictment of the men who kill animals for sport is so effective that U.S. sportsmen who have seen the picture are gutted for him. I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas has sold 50 million copies. It is the most sold record of all time. The song established that there could be a commercially successful secular Christmas song market. Before 1942, Christmas songs and films had come out sporadically. And many were popular. Oh, by the way, anybody ever stay at Holiday Inn?
Huh?
Yeah, Holiday Inn, the hotel.
I think they were there.
Yeah, well,
They were there before.
back around 1955, was it? There was a guy in Memphis, Tennessee, who went to Washington, didn't like the hotel. They stayed in Washington, it was too dirty or whatever. So he decided, I'm going to go into the hotel business. And his architect wrote of the plans for the hotel, wrote on top, Holiday Inn. Now you know the rest of the story. That's the fire in Boston. Believe it or not, because of Pearl Harbor, the government poured money into Massachusetts General Hospital for burns. Some of those victims of the Boston Coconut Grove fire were saved by Pearl Harbor, believe it or not, because the Americans expected from either shore people to come back with bad burns. So they had plasma on hand, critical to reviving some of the Coconut Grove burn victims. There is Bob Hope. 1997, U.S. Congress honored Bob Hope by declaring him the first and only honorary veteran of the U.S. Armed Forces. He spent 48 Christmases overseas with American troops. His final Christmas show during Operation Desert Shield, Saudi Arabia, 1990. Baseball continued. Major League Baseball said, let's keep playing, and they did. It was from the green light letter that Roosevelt sent to Kennesaw Mountain Landis, urging him to play. And it wasn't only baseball, but other sports continued playing, like the National Football League, National Hockey League, using the letter to justify playing. The Brooklyn Americans died in 1946. They were never brought back. The team was never brought back. And there would be 6 teams in the National Hockey League from 1942 to 1967. Then the league doubled in size. This thing is still pumping out propaganda. It is the Voice of America. In 2022, the Voice of America was still used as a propaganda tool in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. supplying a pro-Russian message to those, or rather pro-American message, to those in Russia who could pick up the broadcast. Well, thank you so much. Any questions or comments?
I just lived through this whole thing for 1 hour, everything